Good morning. This is Kenneth and Heather with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here to give you the full recap, the whole story around how did we get here with teachers of color and how do we protect teachers of color. You might have caught some of our previous videos where we did a series talking about different elements around this. So if you want to catch some of our shorter videos, go ahead and check them out. We did 4 smaller videos. This is the one-stop shop. So if you're ready, tune in for the whole thing. But Heather, how are you doing today?
Today I'm good. It's been a very busy week. There's been a lot happening in Minneapolis public schools. Um, but I'm good today.
Yeah. And while there's a lot that's been going on in Minneapolis public schools, in the Minneapolis community, I just think it's so important that we continue to have a focus on how do we ensure that we do not lose a single teacher of color leading into the next school year due to layoffs or accessing, right?
That's right.
And so here we are. I think one of the most important things to recognize about this issue, as there's a lot of tension in the air because of a looming strike in Minneapolis public schools. A lot of different things are being said. I want to ground us in something that is really not as contentious as people are making it sound like it is, right? And it's the fact that both Minneapolis public schools and the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers agree that protecting teachers of color is a priority, and also agree that it's important that we actually protect teachers of color from layoffs outside of seniority order because we know that it disproportionately impacts teachers of color. And so I just really quickly want to pull up these 2 documents, one from Minneapolis Public Schools. This is a summary from their June bargaining session where Minneapolis Public Schools says, in order to accomplish the goal of retaining more teachers of color, it is necessary to disrupt the status quo by finding ways to access, recall, and lay off teachers outside of seniority order, right? And so that is a very clear understanding around, look, we know that this is what is the issue and that what's driving teachers of color out of our classrooms because of our own policies that we have in place. It's not a culture thing. It's like straight up, like this is how we're cutting teachers. Similarly, in a more recent tweet, actually, by the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers, the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers also stated, in order to recruit and retain educators of color, we need to go outside of seniority order if layoffs and accessing occurs. And so this is a part of their Safe and Stable Schools campaign and around all the issues that they're negotiating on. And so again, I want to just reiterate that this is not a contentious thing. This is something that both sides have publicly said that they agree on. This is something that they both have said that they want to prioritize. And so our call today is to say, look, we need it to get done before the end of February so that teachers are not getting informed of layoffs in the early March. If there are no protections in place for teachers of color before the end of February, early March, teachers are going to start being made aware that they are going to be the ones let go. And again, teachers of color are disproportionately going to be the ones that are let go of that. And so Heather, I wanted to just pass it to you and to talk a little bit around like why is it the end of February and why is it that teachers of color are so vulnerable to this?
Yeah, right now, the district has taken all of this information. They've taken birth rates and people who've moved outside of the city and past trends for where students want to go, right? And they make their predictions about which schools will have how many children, and then they send those predictions in a packet to principals. And that process is called budget tie-out. So principals now, over the next 2 weeks, have the really stressful and challenging job of deciding how they're going to spend too little money in their buildings, right? And that is true of public education across this country, but it's really felt hard in urban districts like Minneapolis. And so right now, principals are deciding, okay, am I going to have 3 kindergarten classes or am I going to have 4? Do I have enough students for that? And what am I going to do? And and which positions can I afford to keep and which positions have to go? Once they sit down with their site councils and with their leadership team and they decide on those items, they submit that budget tie-out back to the administration, who then signs off on it. Once that happens, any teachers that they can't afford to keep in that building are now, once that process happens, it's done, and those teachers are going to get that pink slip.
And what I think is really important to note here is that principals don't get to decide which staff members they let go of, right? What ends up happening is because we have this seniority based system of doing layoffs and accessing, is we have a system called last in first out. And so our most recent hires are the ones that are going to be let go. And I think, it's important to acknowledge that Minneapolis Public Schools and the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers have an agreement so that probationary teachers can be laid off outside of seniority order. But even if probationary teachers, so teachers in their first 3 years of service in Minneapolis Public Schools, are protected from any kind of cuts from a building and from the district, what's important to also recognize is that our 4, 5, and 6 year teachers are then most vulnerable. And that's still going to be our teachers of color, because Minneapolis Public Schools has made an effort to increase the new hires of color for their buildings, right? And so I think it's an important point to just recognize that there's a really, really deep relationship between seniority and race, which is why both sides have said we need to make sure that we do accessing and layoffs outside of seniority order so that we aren't disproportionately impacting our teachers of color. And really, because we know teachers of color are so important to our students and their learning, that we just need to make sure we can't lose a single one of them. And so that's why it's so important that these protections come into place now.
Well, yeah, and then what we know is there's been 4 proposals that have gone back and forth. I think it's really important to note that the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers was the first organization to propose this. They sent the first proposal over, and then with that first sending of the proposal, the district had some concerns. Do you want to talk about what some of those concerns were?
Yeah, so with that first proposal, we know that the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers initially said, like, we want to protect educators of color, just explicitly straight up. While I agree and wish that that was the way that we could do it, unfortunately, due to federal law that was supposed to protect people of color, we actually can't do that because we can't make hiring and firing decisions based on race, right? So you can't, and layoff decisions. And so you
Yeah.
can't necessarily say we want to protect somebody, we want to retain somebody's employment status because of their race. We have to find other ways in order to protect teachers of color, and we have to find what they're calling proxies in order to get to a place where they can say, great, we can target most of our teachers of color by saying things like, we went to an HBCU, went to a tribal college,
Bilingual.
bilingual, all these different things. And that was the district's counter proposal is, great, we can't say educators of color, but then let's say people who graduated from MPS, people who live in Minneapolis. And then MFT was like, look, we know that it's very expensive to live in Minneapolis. We know that a lot of our white teachers actually live in Minneapolis. More white teachers live in Minneapolis than our teachers of color. So that doesn't work. And then we also know that there's been like these disparities, these opportunity gaps that have existed in Minneapolis. We know that we have more white graduates from Minneapolis Public Schools than graduates of color who have come back to teach in Minneapolis.
Mhm.
And so really that's going to be a privilege for our white teachers and not our educators of color. From that bargaining session, I remember that bargaining session pretty vividly because I was like, whoa, this is a very different way that they're going about this. I remember, Minneapolis saying, look, what are the proxies that you want to use? Then, like, they were open. They weren't tied to specific proxies. They were open to other ideas and wanting to negotiate that. And so at that point, I remember thinking, oh, we might be close to doing this. If both
I
sides
agree.
agree and
Yeah.
both sides recognize that, maybe the proxies aren't right, but it was an attempt. Let's start to get let's have an actual conversation about this. And this was in the spring of 2021. But then, those conversations started to fall apart and started to become less important as other things started to become a part of the negotiation process.
Yeah, and then when MFT countered back, one of the things that they said was we will accept all of these practices, but we only want to allow them in racially isolated schools. The 15 racially isolated schools. I always feel the need to name this, that like there are more than 15 racially isolated schools in Minneapolis public schools. We don't count white racially isolated schools. And so I mean, I remember that meeting like it was yesterday, because then what I heard some of the district leadership say is like, but wait, we don't want to send the message that teachers of color are only worth protecting or only valuable in certain spaces. We heard them say things like, look, the few students of color in largely white schools, they need a teacher of color maybe more than anybody. And so we need to protect teachers of color across the district, right? So that was like another proposal. And then what happened?
Well, then that was kind of it for public conversation around teachers of color, which was really frustrating because, like we said, we thought they were getting closer, that we thought they were getting to a good point. Then this next bargaining session, where all of a sudden the protections for teachers of color went from district wide to only 15 schools in the district. And then we didn't hear anything about protections for teachers of color for the rest of the bargaining from June until the end of September. And I think that's a really important thing to bring up because, part of the reason why we're saying that this needs to become a priority is because we saw it not be a priority
That's
for
right.
so long from after that June negotiation session, right? And they came back in August, they had 4 or 5 more bargaining sessions. And then after that August, or after that June bargaining session, teachers of color were never brought up. We heard MPS say, hey, can we talk about teachers of color, please? Like, we know this is a priority for the community. And, MFT shut that down. They said, no, we want to talk about COVID. And that's what they spent time talking about. And so then when contract negotiations went behind closed doors, it's hard to know what has gone back and forth, what have been the topics of conversation. But we know that, publicly, a lot of the focus around what's being discussed in terms of, contract negotiations and why a potential strike might happen and all of these things is because, COVID has been a concern. Wages for ESPs has been a concern. Wages for
Absolutely.
teachers have been a concern, right? And so,
Absolutely.
but like, teachers of color are also a concern, and teachers of color are on a really tight deadline if we want to make sure that teachers of color
That's right.
are protected from layoffs and excessing this school year, right?
That's right.
And so that's been the journey that the district has been on with MFT in order to try to figure out this conversation to protect teachers of color.
Yeah, I was able to talk to one principal this week who was like, I really don't want to have to let this brand new teacher of color go, this first year teacher of color, and my budget tryout is coming, and I'm really going to be struggling to figure out a way to keep this teacher. And so I think that is the reality that we are putting upon principals and school communities right now if we don't commit to doing this. And I think as much as our city has been through, as much as our children have been through, as much as we have been through with COVID and all of the things, this has to happen. We need to prioritize this. We need to walk our walk with this situation, and we need two willing parties to get this deal done.
Right. And so the good news is that there is a pathway forward towards a solution, right? Despite the fact that there hasn't been any public proposal that has been made available from MFT or from MPS since December, when MFT last provided a public proposal, which really landed back where they initially left off in June, right?
Yeah.
There is a pathway forward. So Robbinsdale and St. Louis Park both have figured out a way to come to an agreement to protect teachers of color. And it actually mirrors a similar agreement that MFT and MPS have made in order to protect probationary teachers. And that is to say, if we can figure out a way to protect teachers of color by using the language of underrepresented in comparison to the student population, then we can find a way to protect our teachers of color, right? And so using that proxy language instead of graduates from MPS, instead of using language from living residents of Minneapolis, right? Like, they can use this language of underrepresented, which also MFT has put forward as an opportunity. back in their first proposal, they used the language of underrepresented, right? And so I think that's a really important and key point when looking at what are the things that can be done. Like the solution is there, it's on the table. We can't, like the other districts have done it. And so it is pretty easy to replicate. We just need to make sure that there aren't any unnecessary limitations on those protections, right? Like we shouldn't limit those protections to just probationary teachers. It should be for all teachers of color. We shouldn't just limit those protections for teachers with certain licensure types. Like it should be for all, again, all teachers of color in Minneapolis. We shouldn't limit those protections just from layoffs. It should be from accessing and layoffs, because a teacher leaving a building and accessing is just as disruptive as a teacher of color leaving the district, right? And so, there is a pathway forward out there. It does involve, again, protecting teachers of color outside of seniority order. And the thing is that both sides have provided proposals that have actually said that they wanted to protect teachers of color outside of seniority order. So there is a pathway forward. We agree on the problem. We need to find a way to a solution. The thing is that there has to be a way to prioritize that solution before the end of February in order to protect teachers of color. And that is where racial justice actually exists, to make that a priority before there are casualties that have to live the experiences of being cut unnecessarily.
That's right.
And so I think it's just time. We have to get this done. And that's all I got on that.
I would agree. Well, this has been a long conversation, and I hope this is helpful to folks who are maybe struggling to figure out what's going on. And so thank you so much, Kenneth, for taking the time to break this down.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time to do this with me, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Bye.